All right, everyone. Very warmly welcome to the Resistance Studies Speaker Series. That is organized by the Resistance Studies Initiative, where I have some information over there that brings some light on what that is, but it's a recent effort by UMass to create interest and research and teaching around unarmed resistance. So among the different activities we have, the Journal of Resistance Studies, courses on civil resistance, but also the speaker series. So in this speaker series, we are today very happy to have Professor Leila Kawar from political science that will be speaking on migration and resistance. I hope that you have questions in these dangerous times we're living in now, approaching Trump land, where it will be really important to explore what we can do. And I think during the discussions we could have the opportunity to think more about strategies of resistance in protecting people that are undocumented in this country, in migration. If you want to get our announcements on different activities relating to resistance, we promise to not send out other things than what is actually relating to resistance. Please sign up your name here. And also, if you're not want the information, it's good for us to have some documentation of people that are coming here. So please fill in that one that is circulating. All right, and there is also some snacks over there that you can take. All right. My name is Stella Bintargen. I'm professor of sociology. All right. So welcome, and particularly welcome to you.
I was going to read that.
Oh yes.
So today is a fortuitous day for talking about deportation resistance, because if you walk down the pathway or if you were part of the protest, there is in fact a walkout going on that I think has now returned from Whitmore Hall. But the UMass walkout is part of a protest for sanctuary campuses that is taking place at over 150 universities across the country today. So CNN was covering it on the TVs in the student union, and we are one of the peer institutions such as Brown, Harvard, and Yale that are in the process of becoming a sanctuary campus. So the protests delivered some demands to the chancellor, asking him to commit to making UMass a sanctuary campus, which involves supporting communities that commit to not using their state and local enforcement apparatus to enforce federal immigration laws, and that promise to promote integration and community involvement in support of undocumented migrants. So stay tuned, but I wanted to say that I'm very happy to have this vibe on campus as I talk about some of my research. So I had originally planned to give a book talk because my book was published about a year ago, and here's the book. And then over the past week, I rewrote my talk and decided I wanted it to be something more publicly engaged. So what you'll get today is a little bit of the book and a lot of my thoughts about how the current moment and deportation resistance today can be better understood in light of the way that resistance to deportation has manifested itself in other places and over the past 40 years. And I'll show a lot of pictures, and then at the end maybe we can talk about your thoughts on the path ahead. So I'll start with this. Is a photo from the United We Dream website, and the quote is taken from them, and this is part of their blog. It was published the day after the election, and this is what they say. to Donald Trump and the Republican Party, we say we are here to stay, and we are never backing down. All people with love in our hearts are angered and disappointed tonight and pledge to resist mass deportation. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Border Patrol Agency have proven themselves to be agents of racism and agents of hate, and we will resist them. This is our home, and we are here to stay. United We Dream is probably the best known and most well-organized of the many grassroots groups that has now a national alliance. And it's composed of students who were brought here having been born outside of the country, who are undocumented, but who have spent most of their lives here and who are schooled in the United States and who are asking for a regularization of their status, which they've partially achieved through President Obama's executive actions. But as you may or may not know, these executive actions are time limited. So the way that the DACA program operates is that it needs to be renewed every 2 years. And with the coming president, it's likely that those renewals will not take place. And the students are also, the dreamers are disappointed that the executive action on behalf of their parents, the DAPA program, was never implemented. Although President Obama signed it, a district judge in Texas issued an injunction saying that it had exceeded executive authority, and so that relief from deportation, or at least deprioritization of deportation for their parents, has never been implemented. So the Dreamers first hoped for a law through Congress, the DREAM Act. They didn't get that. They got a temporary reprieve from deportation for themselves, and now they may even lose that. But as you can see, they're fighting, and they're trying to be public. And I think that the sanctuary campus movement is an important part of that. So when I started researching this topic, I was actually thinking more about these people than about undocumented students. Who are these people? Well, they're attorneys. On the left, you have a group of very engaged young attorneys at a National Lawyers Guild convention who are brainstorming legal strategies for a case brought on behalf of Haitian refugees who were arriving by sea in South Florida, and who lawyers repeatedly tried to assist through lawsuits. And then you have the successful legal team in the American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg case, which did not result in a court decision. It settled, but the settlement was enormously influential for reforming our country's asylum system. So this 1991 settlement guaranteed that all Central Americans who had been in the country for some years prior to 1991, and that was a very large number of people because of the wars in Central America, would have a second chance to claim asylum and given a more supportive environment in which to make those claims. So you see the attorneys in the front, and then behind them are two Salvadorans who are holding the banner, the Central American Refugee Organization's umbrella group. So these are the American lawyers, but as you see from this picture, two pictures which I took as I was starting to do my dissertation research, protests against deportation are not confined to this country, and they're going on in many migrant-receiving states. And nationalities involved may be different. The rhetoric used, the colors of the flag might change, but the phenomenon overall of taking to the streets to protest at the grassroots against deportation policies and border enforcement more generally is something that is part of our current moment. And the further I got into the project, the more taken I was with doing a comparison of how the US and French pictures were similar and different in terms of how law and legal expertise has come into this area of protest. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, for the most part, is the French side, because my guess is that you probably know less about it than you do about the American side of things. But at the end, I'm happy to talk about the American side as well and have some engaged back and forth. But for the next 30, 35 minutes or so, I think I'll sort of take you through the story of how deportation resistance in France has evolved over the past 40 years, and talk a little bit about the political context for this type of protest and how law has been in it and what it's like today. So let's start with the 1970s. As I described in my book, it was at this moment that something akin to public protest against deportation policies emerged in both the United States and in France. And for the engaged faculty in the room, do you recognize these people? The bald guy with the glasses, the shorter guy with the glasses. It's Sartre and Foucault, yeah. So in 1971, when this photo was taken, it was just the very beginning of left's growing awareness that immigrant workers in France were, in fact, an oppressed group that they wanted to be associated with supporting. And began as sort of an outgrowth of the May 1968 movement and Foucault's subsequent work with prisoners in French jails, first who had been in prison and then prisoners more generally. But then he sort of branched out to talk about those who were oppressed by power structures more generally. And although Sartre and Foucault theoretically had their differences, Sartre also was present for this type of protesting. And the groups that they were trying to support are the ones that you see over here. So this is a protest of the Mouvement des Travailleurs Immigrés, which was an umbrella group that emerged originally from a group called the Mouvement des Travailleurs Arabes, Arab immigrant workers movement, but that came to incorporate gradually both Portuguese migrant workers and migrant workers from sub-Saharan Africa. And those are the three largest groups at this time because the EU did not yet allow freedom of movement from Portugal to France. That hadn't happened yet. So these three groups had large numbers of migrant workers in France who, beginning in the 1970s, were increasingly squeezed by the government's move towards restrictionist border control. So I'll talk more about that, but let me first show you one other picture. These are photos taken from the past 6 years. And again, I just wanted to show the parallel. These are, on the left, a group of what I'll describe as the sans-papiers, those who are undocumented, without papers. And they're engaged in a street protest for regularization, meaning the same thing that the Dreamers are asking for. And on the right, this is a terrible photo, but it's a little better in the book. It's a protest by attorneys and activists outside the French Council of State building. So this is the highest administrative court in France. And the attorneys in France are actually staging a sit-in protest accompanied by, this flag here is the flag of the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, which is the League for Human Rights. It's a sort of mainstay of the institutional left in France. And they're protesting the Conseil d'Etat's recent decision, this is in the fall of 2010, which allowed the government to house asylum seekers outdoors in tents if there were no longer spaces in dormitories for them while they awaited their asylum decision. And the Conseil d'Etat said that that was reasonable. And the immigrant rights advocates were very disappointed, so they're protesting. So 37 years later, protest looks like this, but my point is just that the dynamics are still there, that there are grassroots struggles, and then there are elite supporters who are allies and who try to support them. And that there's a little bit of a struggle about who will take the lead between the two, but overall, the policies that they are protesting have not changed incredibly much. So let me tell you a little bit about France, for those who don't know why migrants are there, where they had come from, and why they wanted to stay. France, after World War II, relied heavily on from outside metropolitan France to rebuild itself. And during the 30 years of high economic growth from 1945 to 1975, most of those people came from France's colonies or territories or domestic overseas dominions. So this would be North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit the Middle East, a little bit Mauritius, and some other places that France had a colonial involvement with. So mostly young men came to France, and most of them came without papers. There simply was no border enforcement. The way that it worked was that you came, you found a job, you showed up with your letter of employment from your boss, and the local prefect would regularize you. So not everyone bothered because there wasn't that much deportation going on, but you can see that in the red graph of the number of regularizations tracks them. And this sort of laissez-faire, or we'll fix it after you get here approach to immigration policy came to an abrupt end after the 1973 oil shocks and the recession that followed, which really brought an end also to this period of high economic growth. So the guest worker programs, to the extent that they had been institutionalized, were ended between 1973 and 1974. And there were a variety of official incentive schemes to encourage workers to go home. But many of these people had been there for a long time. They had brought their families to join them, and they wanted to stay. So the government and its large migrant worker population are at odds for most of the 1970s. And you see the first public demonstrations to resist deportation and demand regularization during this time period. So this is a photo from 1978, and you see the banners are in different languages. The one in the front is in Arabic, and they're asking for a right to get a work permit and a residence card, but also to be able to form associations, because in France, unlike here, to operate legally as a NGO, you need to be registered with the state. And that was denied to groups that were run by foreigners. So this is also part of the claims that they're making at this time. And it's the time when, as you saw with the picture of Foucault and Sartre, the post-1968 progressive movement in France is taking this on as one of its causes. So you see the poster here of French workers and immigrant workers united against the factory boss in the middle. And when they're united, they're stronger.
The coloring.
Right, right. I think also printing technology was not super sophisticated. But you're right. So for the immigrant workers at this time, it's the 70s was the period of Carlos the Jackal, and the PLO has its headquarters in Paris, and it's a moment of anti-imperial struggle. And so this is how they frame their protest. It's part of a larger liberation movement. And it gets support from French grassroots groups with links to this May 1968 movement. What happens is that the left is elected into power in 1981 with François Mitterrand becoming the president. And to some extent, that puts an end to the movement, for better or worse. Because Mitterrand, one of his first things that he does in office is he has a legalization program, like the one that we had in this country in 1986. So a large number of migrants are able to regularize their status, and that really saps the air out of the protests because people are able to get the work permit and the residence cards that they'd been hoping to get. But of course, not everyone can regularize, and more people continue to come, and so there's sort of a struggle between those who are on the far left, continue protesting, and those who say, well, let's work with the Mitterrand government, work within the system, adopt sort of more institutionalized repertoires of advocacy. Mitterrand's brief period of catering to the left really comes to an end rather quickly, because starting in 1983, the National Front, the Front National with Jean-Marie Le Pen, does very well in local elections in France, and by 1986, a government of the right is elected. And so Mitterrand is still the president, but this cohabitation of right and left parties starting in the mid-80s will continue for about 15 years. And one of the results of that is that there is a greater emphasis in government policies on border enforcement. So the movements of the 70s had been successful in regularizing those people, and also to some extent in changing France's citizenship laws so that children born of migrants could become French citizens relatively easily. But going to be stepped up border controls to protect against new arrivals, or to prevent new arrivals from coming easily. So there are controls within the countries of origin, at the airports, at the ports. There's also a tightening up in the prefectures, who are no longer willing to renew residence permits for people who become unemployed, for people who have their families coming to join them. There are police patrols, raids on workplaces, on immigrant housing. There is reduced access to asylum. So now if you, in France, as in the United States, there's an initial triage system where your application can be thrown out if it doesn't pass an initial hurdle. So there's a way to discourage asylum seekers, and the growth of detention centers, the use of military planes to deport people, and then the use of electronic databases, which is what we do here now, so that if you are stopped on the street or for a traffic stop, a speeding ticket, anything like that, they can look up your record, including in the immigration database, and see if you have a deportation order outstanding. So all of this sort of comes to be part of France's immigration regime beginning in the mid-80s. And many of them are still with us in terms of what immigration laws look like today. At the same time, migration has not stopped, because we live in a globalized world, and economic integration and the involvement in economies in the global south of corporations from the global north has produced continuing flows of people. They come now from slightly different places. You can see Senegal, Mali, Morocco, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, China, Ukraine, and Albania, and for quite a while also from the Eastern European countries before the EU freedom of movement regime. So there are, at the moment, approximately 300 to 400,000 clandestine migrants, meaning people without documents, who are in France today. It seems small in comparison to the number in the US. Do you guys know how many undocumented migrants there are in the US?
11 million.
Yeah. It's hard to estimate exactly, but it's about 11 million. So France has a smaller number, but it's still a fairly large number for the size of their population. And the other thing which I want to bring attention to as a law person is that there are legal avenues, despite this tightening of executive border control in France, as here are ways that can. One of them is that in Europe, it was really the French Council of State who did this first, but it became part of the European court's jurisprudence subsequently, that migrants who have strong family connections to France have a judge review whether their deportation order is excessive or not, whether there's a interest in having them removed, or whether their right to maintain a family life with their family in France outweighs it. It's not exactly a balancing test, but there are conflicting considerations that the courts have said should be taken into account. And this is particularly important for migrants from France's former colonial territories, because many of their family members are French citizens. France, when it ended the Algerian War, when it lost the Algerian War, in the Evian Accords that ended that conflict, it agreed to give French citizenship to those who asked for it before a cutoff date. And many Algerians did not ask French colonial citizenship from them, and they became de facto Algerian. Those who did ask were given French citizenship. And a generation of young people who grew up from that in relatively resource-deprived neighborhoods and found themselves on the wrong end of law enforcement are also, of course, international law and the UN. So there's talk of revising it or doing away from it, still exists, and so you can still in France asylum. You may not get it. The rules continue to change, so if you come from a safe country, country presumed includes a number of places where it's pretty questionable, you are unlikely to get refugee status, but this is the main window through which, even if you come clandestinely or irregularly, you could still claim relief against deportation. So with these kind of different forces at play, what we see in France is that beginning in the early 1990s, migrants who have come without papers or who have lost their papers because they lost their jobs, who've tried to claim asylum or who've tried to stay in some other way but have not been successful. In many cases, there are people who tried to claim asylum and their claims were just never processed. Because in France, until recently, if the administration did not want to do something for you, it could simply not act. And that meant that you were de facto denied. These people started to say, we're here, and we need some help. We are needy. We're asylum seekers. And so they're framing their cause primarily in humanitarian terms. Not that we have a right, but that we're desperate and please help us. So I'll show a quick graph of new applicants for asylum. You can see that, and this looks very much the same in the United States, there are sort of large spikes when the backlog sort of backs up to a certain point. There's a delay in processing time, and so more people have an incentive to apply for asylum, and it could be months or years before any action is taken, if it ever will be. So this is what these mobilizations of the sans-papiers, those without papers, look like in the 1990s. It's largely Africans, but you see it's families. They take refuge or take sanctuary in churches. And there's one particularly kind of dramatic confrontation where the police invade a church and different leftist advocates go and place their bodies in the way. The police take these African families away. It was embarrassing for the government. And there was some union support, so the Air France labor unions refused to participate in staffing the flights that were going to take them back to their countries of origin. So what happens is the government, to save face, starts to give little gestures. Unlike the 1981 regularization, which had been sort of a blanket, everyone is included, what you see in the 1990s is a series of sort of mini regulations. So there's an order from the Interior that says, well, if you've created a professional and familial environment in France and can document that, come to your prefecture, show us your documents, give us your dossier, and we'll decide whether you're eligible. But it's always the discretion of the local prefecture. And it's not automatic. You have to prove it. And it's not really clear what the standards are. So, of 45,000 people who apply, 15,000 are regularized. Not really clear how they are picked. And in 1997, again, it's a discretionary assessment of ties to France. Out of 150,000 applicants, 90,000 are regularized. So throughout the 1990s, this is the approach. It's sort of, let's not have another embarrassing protest, but also let's not offend the National Front by showing that we're too friendly to migrants. And this is how they do it. That changes with the entrance onto the scene of this man, Nicolas Sarkozy, who is eventually elected president, but initially has an influence as Minister of Interior beginning in 2003. And Sarkozy decides that part of his strategy of political ambition will be to cater to the far right on immigration issues. So he's going to be a law and order type of politician, and to some extent it's successful. So he says, well, I'm in favor of economic growth, so we will issue employment visas to the immigrants that we want, meaning people who have, tech skills, but the workers that we don't want, who came without our permission, we're going to really get tough on them. And he revives, to some extent, the protest movement, because as soon as the pressure increases, people are no longer content to go one by one to the prefecture. It's much harder to get regularized, and so they take to the streets again. And so you see the emergence of lively protest activity. One of the more memorable groups, which is still, is this one, the Network for Education Without Borders, the Réseau d'Éducation Sans Frontières. And it's a group of sort of local neighborhoods, school councils, some religious organizations, some human rights NGOs, who decide to sponsor undocumented children and their families. So the children are in schools, and the parents of their classmates decide to make their schools, they're mostly elementary, and to provide sanctuary in their families. And in France, this is an emotionally poignant move because during World War II, there were what were called rafles, or roundups, of Jewish school children throughout most of France's cities and towns. And so that this is being framed in terms of not allowing children to be rounded up is an immense mobilizing framework in the French cultural context. But it's not the only one. You have here a die-in protest outside of the Ministry of Interior. They're members of ACT UP, its French branch. And then you have these collectives of sans-papiers. You can see they look different from the African families now. It's more mixed. This is a collective for a neighborhood in Paris, and the sign here says, "Against disposable immigration." And the League of Human Rights is supporting them. So it's a mix of undocumented people and their supporters. And there starts to be sort of a network of different organizations linked to one another. So you see some websites get started up. The movement, sort of like the Occupy movement, is decentralized. It's composed of autonomous collectives who mobilize on the street in order to push the local prefecture to regularize more people. And often what happens is that you protest, the prefecture finally gives in and says, okay, organizers of your collective, give us all the dossiers that you have, and then we'll decide which ones we will give papers to. So the cat and mouse element to it, I guess. But there are also gestures at larger coalition building, and as you saw with this sign against disposable immigration, it was part of the anti-globalization movement at this time period, and I'll show you a few more pictures of that as well. So this is another collective from May 2006. It's called the Collectif des Exilés, or the in Paris, and it includes Afghans, Iraqis, Kurds, Iranians, all of whom have been previously at the border in Calais between France and the Channel, and who have been cleared out of there and who've come to Paris. So this happens periodically as well. It happened just last month. And here's another demonstration. This is the Collectif des Sans-Papiers, formed in 2001. It has 100 members. It's supported by the range of sort of left-wing groups. It occupies the mayor's residence of the 7th arrondissement in Paris in order to request that the Minister of Interior intercede on their behalf. And you can see, sort of the style of protest. It's small but public. Beginning in 2008, the protests take on a slightly different form because they come to be supported by one of France's major labor federations, the CGT, which has links to France's now largely defunct Communist Party. But the CGT is still very strong, and as has happened with the unions in this country, the AFL-CIO now is supportive of undocumented workers. The CGT takes this issue in hand and sees it as a way to unionize undocumented migrants and undocumented migrant workers to reduce precarious employment of its members. So rather than calling for undocumented workers to be kicked out, they're saying, let's raise the bar for all workers, rather than have a race to the bottom with these vulnerable people who employers can keep on as, quasi-indentured servants and not pay them very much because they fear deportation. So the CGT lends its institutional network to this public protest movement. And you see here the union banners with some of these undocumented migrant workers. And the theme for the campaign is called "On bosse ici, on reste ici," which is, we work here, we're staying here. And when I was doing my research, I came across these protests really throughout Paris on a regular basis. This one is in the front of the Paris financial market, the Bourse. And you see that they're telling the passers-by that they have been laid off because they are without documents, but they're not without rights, and they're supported by the CGT. So this is, I think, interesting because we really haven't seen it very much in the country, that membership in the workforce, rather, that you're a young student who has your life ahead of you, that the fact that you're working is the grounds for you claiming membership. But in France, as we saw in the 70s, that was part of their repertoire, and it becomes very central more recently, as you see. So here's another group of protesters supported by the union. And again, it's sort of the same game. They protest until the prefecture is ready to consider their list of dossiers, and they hand the dossier over that as many people will be regularized as possible. So throughout this period, continue to appear, and at the same time, the government continues officially to be wedded to a fairly restrictionist immigration policy. There's increased use of retention centers, increased penalties for those who do not leave once they have a deportation order. Asylum continues to be more restricted, and then there are criminal penalties for migrant trafficking, which may seem sort of reasonable until you realize that people could be accused of trafficking if they are helping their extended family members to come to France. The definition of it is really quite broad. In addition to that, at the European Union level, there's the creation of a border enforcement agency starting 10 years ago called Frontex. And there's a coordination with countries of origin, such as Libya, Morocco, Turkey, so that those countries will do the policing instead of the European Union having to do it. But protest continues to take place. Oh, here it is. This one was one of my favorites. They're standing outside of the Museum of Immigration in Paris, which is also the former Colonial Exposition Hall, which is kind of nutty. But it's now the Museum of Immigration. And you can see the CGT banners. These are undocumented workers. And at the protest, the sign that they have says, "Yesterday colonized, today exploited, tomorrow regularized." So again, this link to anti-imperial struggle. This is from 2010. And then this one, I think, is also particularly nice. It's a group of undocumented migrants of sans-papiers who march from France-Afrique, which is French, and the World Social Forum in Dakar, Senegal, funded by a Catholic NGO. And they regroup with those who have been deported and those who are thinking about emigrating to France. And the goal of it is perhaps to capture some of this global coalition building and think about globalization as a larger structure rather than as simply on an individual humanitarian level. Of course, political context, though, matters. And when a government of the left, which is still in power, that of President Hollande, is elected in 2012, there's some co-optation and the same old strategy of offering regularization to a few people on a case-by-case basis, maybe only just for 1 year. This is really what President Obama did too with these DACA deprioritization of deportation orders. And so there's an overall decline, I would say, over the past 4 years in these street mobilizations, although local sporadic protests continue. So I think my take on this overall is that The main features of these protests are that they are a hodgepodge. They pull on a variety of different repertoires of collective action. They talk in humanitarian terms, in terms of labor rights, in terms of individual rights claims. They're largely spontaneous and short-lived. They have few institutions linking them to prior movements, although that's a little bit less the case with the involvement of unions. But they're supported primarily by local charities, by social workers, by legal advocates. And the government response has largely been one of cooptation through this piecemeal style of regularization that is accompanied by heightened immigration enforcement. And then I just thought I would show you a few very recent pictures. So this is, since 2014, if you've been watching the news, you know that there has been large-scale migration. It's called crisis migration in the newspapers, but it's people who are fleeing conflict in largely the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, and in Afghanistan, and who are coming to and who are crossing through various routes, but they get to France largely at the Italian border. And at one point, the French government actually controlled its border with Italy, which was somewhat scandalous because the EU says there should be no controls within the freedom of movement area, but these border patrols were reestablished explicitly to prevent these large numbers of migrants fleeing conflict from coming from Italy and moving into France. Many of them wanted to move eventually to the United Kingdom, but to get there they would go from Italy through France and then through the Channel. And so you see, again, this call for freedom of movement. This is actually a picture of the camp in Calais that was just destroyed last month. There were a large number of people there, largely Afghans, Iraqis, some Syrians. And they were moved out of this really very poor conditions encampment and put in various residences in other parts of France while their asylum claims are going to be processed. But it does not mean that they are able to stay necessarily, because many of their asylum claims will be rejected. But for the most part, the clearing of the camp was a peaceful affair because conditions were just so poor that the migrants had given up on staying there and attempting to cross through the Channel. But you see graffiti on the wall. It says, "No border, no nation." You have the anarchist sign. And then some of the far left groups like ATTAC and Alternative Libertaire were involved in supporting these migrants. So I guess the question I want to leave with is, what is deportation resistance? Is it securing an individual exception? Is it challenging structures of power? Is it sometimes both, sometimes more one than the other? And I think it's an important question for the protesters to ask and for their supporters to listen to. And I thought, if you'll just indulge me, I would read a little bit from the conclusion chapter of my book, where I give my thoughts about the current moment and what the considerations are for those who care about migrants who live among us. So in the current moment, immigration governance is positioned within a vortex of globalization, characterized by the increased integration of first world economies, their heightened dominance over world economic processes, and their increasing reliance on third world labor. Within such a system, as legal scholar Kitty Calavita writes, immigration is like a mirror. It exposes how lawmaking in liberal democracies coexists with and legitimizes conditions of extreme material inequality. If anything, the beginning of the 21st century has witnessed a further heightening of immigration restrictionism. After 9/11, the philosophy known as enforcement first became the de facto prism through which legislators and administrators responded to irregular migration, with the consequence that changes to the immigration system focused almost entirely on building enforcement programs and improving their performance. Over the past 2 decades, policymakers have made the system of deporting migrants for post-entry criminal conduct more efficient, less discretionary, and substantially more rigid, in what has been described as a dramatic convergence between the deportation system and the earlier war against crime. And one of the people, I just add as an aside, who's written the most about this will be coming to UMass this March. It's Professor Daniel Canstrom. So mark your calendars. He'll be here the entire week of March 20th through 24th. So for jurists who have devoted their to the project of expanding immigrant rights, and for other supporters of undocumented migrants, these are all very discouraging developments. These adverse circumstances call for efforts that are not only technically adept, but also creative. The current moment may also call for creative rethinking of the division of labor that has developed between immigration lawyering and immigrant lawyering. So the people that I studied are primarily thinking of themselves as immigration lawyers. They specialize in the laws related to deportation, residency. But immigrant lawyering is a broader category. As legal scholar and activist Frances Ansley has written, in the context of free trade, unchained global capital, and the dispossession of labor in the global South, careful and long-term thought and outreach, especially efforts to build solidarity between immigrants and citizens who are similarly excluded from the global economy, are very much in order for those who care about reform in the immigration policy domain and social justice more broadly. Along these lines, a number of recent initiatives have combined expertise in immigration law with a range of other legal tools as part of a broader strategy to resist inegalitarian globalization. Community organizers have ambitions that go beyond what lawyers can achieve. They aim to develop broad-based alliances and shared conceptions of systemic harm necessary for what critical legal theorist Boa de Sousa Santos refers to as, quote, counter-hegemonic globalization. To adopt this perspective is to recognize that activities centered in state institutions, including in courts, can be part of a social justice mobilization, while emphasizing that legal expertise cannot work alone, and it must be put into dialogue with localized forms of legal knowledge. One final point: if mobilizations built on the fusion of subaltern and institutional law hold emancipatory potential, it is in part through their capacity to rethink dominant legal categories. Then perhaps looking beyond any single national setting, as I have attempted to do, can also contribute to shaking up categories of governance that come to be taken for granted. In the case of immigrant rights advocacy, the process of translating one set of cultural categories into the terms of another, and vice versa, highlights how advocates across national settings respond to a common systemic harm that is manifested in, but that also exceeds, the politics of restrictionism. Bringing this common threat into focus, while also showing points of difference among responses, can potentially unsettle unconscious assumptions about the limits of what is possible. In this way, comparison prevents any single strategy from becoming too settled in the guise of a pre-given natural or functional adaptation. As a hybrid political legal project, immigrant rights legal activism has built its claims by developing creative extensions of existing legal avenues and applying them to new policy initiatives in the immigration domain. Yet even in high-profile cases, judicial holdings are more lasting influence resulted from the political mobilizations catalyzed by the process of legal contestation. Because there is no red herring of assertive constitutional review in immigration matters, this domain of legal engagement encourages an approach that looks beyond compliance with official case dispositions so as to multiply the dimensions along which we trace the passage of law. Even in the immigration policy domain, whereas legal theorist Catherine d'Auvergne has written, migrant rights are always simultaneously conjuring the more forceful rights of the state to create illegality. The process of deploying nationally distinct juridical instruments has important effects. Focusing on the actual practices set in motion by these legal contestations allows us to see all of the translations they affect in all of their fragility and specificity. The findings of my study demonstrate that scholars of immigration politics should take law seriously while recognizing that it's possible to do so without reproducing a narrative that presents litigation as a salvation for groups engaged in political struggle. Understanding the constructive potential of law while appreciating the wide array of culturally productive associations set in motion by activity in court advances the project of breaking down rigidified borders, whether territorial or conceptual. That's where I end my book. So to some extent, that's where I end my thoughts about this. And I'm always happy to have other people, their thoughts, so that as I continue to think about these things for my next book, I can think about them in a fresh way. So with that, I'd like to open to your questions about either movements in this country or what's going on in France right now. I'm very happy to hear your answers to this question that I'll leave up on the board. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.